Three, two, one. Welcome to three, two, one. This is Wikipedia Weekly, episode 116 for June 12th, 2014. Wikipedia and Public Relations. Welcome to another episode of Wikipedia Weekly. I'm your host, Andrew Lee, also known as user Fuzheado on the English Wikipedia. Pete?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Pete Forsyth with Wiki Strategies. I am user Pete Forsyth on Wikipedia. And, yeah, go on.
Kevin, you're muted. You're still muted.
Since
we heard you before.
Maybe since we both messed up, we should start over.
I'd be okay with that.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the format right.
I'll introduce Kevin. That's Kevin Gorman, Wikipedia in residence at University of California, Berkeley, also known as user Kevin Gorman. Tom?
I'm Tom Fish, user Guerillero on the English Wikipedia.
And I am William or Bill Beutler. I am user WWB on the English Wikipedia.
Great. So welcome to another episode of Wikipedia Weekly, and we are following the last episode with less than a week because we had a pretty significant announcement this past week in June of 2014, and I thought we'd dedicate the entire episode to talking about this. And this was basically a page that was released on Wikipedia under the title Statement on Wikipedia from Participating Communications Firms. And it starts off saying, on February 7th, 2014, a roundtable discussion was held at Donovan House in Washington, D.C., and is basically an announcement of a number of prominent PR firms in the United States, which states their, I guess, recognition of Wikipedia's operating principles, and is a sort of a pledge that these PR companies are going to abide by the terms of use of Wikipedia and also the policies and guidelines related to conflict of interest. So, in full disclosure, two of the folks on this podcast, myself and Bill Beutler, were part of the crew that met in February 2014 with prominent PR companies and a few other Wikipedia editors to just have a roundtable discussion about the relationship of Wikipedia and public relations. So for folks who've been following this topic for a long time, you know that it's been about a decade of a running battle, whether it's individuals who've been editing Wikipedia for pay, or boutique firms that have been editing Wikipedia on behalf of clients, or whether it's major, large PR firms, or even corporate representatives or corporate PR folks who've been caught editing Wikipedia either within or without compliance with Wikipedia's guidelines. It's made for kind of a complicated landscape over the last 10 years. You might know that Jimmy Wales has a pretty firm stance in terms of a bright line saying that people who are paid to edit should not ever get engaged with direct article editing. And even though that's not policy, that is kind of a norm in the community that's a value that's held by a number of Wikipedians, but not all Wikipedians. So it's been kind of a murky relationship between either paid editors or corporate representatives or advocacy editors and even Wikipedians in residence. So we've really never had a real sit-down with PR companies and Wikipedia editors, and this was in February 2014 that I think this is the first time it's ever really happened. So this statement that was put out got a lot of press coverage. If you go to the page, which is under the shortcut PRCom, and I'll try to bring up the page here. It's pretty short, but it's pretty significant in terms of what it tries to state. So if you look at the PRCom page, you'll see that it's a statement on Wikipedia from participating communication firms, and some of the details here in the 5 bullets include the pledge to act in accordance with the conflict of interest guidelines and the terms of use. And then there's some pretty significant participants: Ogilvy and Mather, Burson Marsteller, Ketchum, Edelman. For folks who are not familiar with the PR world, these are the big ones. These are the big guys. And there are also some other folks who've signed on later on, like the Chartered Institute of Public Relations in the UK, Council of Public Relations Firms. So it got a lot of coverage. If you scroll down the bottom of the document, you'll see that there's a lot of media coverage from the trade rags like Ad Age or PR Week to folks like Time Magazine, Wall Street Journal, The Independent UK, and then also blog posts by representatives from these different PR companies. So pretty significant coverage, and it made a pretty big media splash. So I thought I'd turn it over to Bill next to just explain a little bit about how this came about and what he views as the rationale or the motivation for this type of statement from the PR companies.
Sure thing. Thanks, Andrew. So as you say, it's been a process of several months going. For me, where to start? For me, it starts a long time ago, I suppose. I've been on Wikipedia since 2006. And in that same year, I went to go work I moved from journalism over to a social media marketing firm. And that was when I was, getting my feet wet at Wikipedia. Not long after I realized that, my firm had clients that had pages that weren't very good, but the conflict of interest rules said, stay away. But yet there had to be some way to give feedback. It couldn't be right that they, just had to take whatever their detractors would say, or let things stay out of date or inaccurate. So, starting really about 2008, actually, I started developing, best practices that have evolved over time to help square that circle. And in 2010, I hung out my own shingle to do this. And I think I was not the first person to do this, but I'm one who has done it better than most. And I've always tried to take a pro-community approach to doing so. And as someone who's always tried to do so, it's always a matter of frustration to me that whenever the topics of Wikipedia and PR are in the news together, it's because someone's got their hand caught in the proverbial cookie jar. And, it's the last time this happened was this company, WikiPR, which every PR company of which I'm familiar would not consider them to be a true industry colleague, but based on what they were doing and what they called themselves, when the headlines were written, it was PR industry messing with Wikipedia, editing on the sly, etc. So, like I said, frustrated to me that was how it always went. When I know and I've seen through my own work and others' work that it can be done in an ethical way, in a way that helps build Wikipedia and make it a better resource. There actually is a lot more overlap between what a responsible public relations person would hope to accomplish and what Wikipedia wants its own project to be. So this was what led me to convene the meeting that you and I attended in February. And I didn't know exactly how it would go, but I had a hunch that if we brought together Wikipedians with PR practitioners, that they would find that they actually had more in common than they might have thought they did. And that is exactly what I found. By the way, can you hear me well, or is the audio weak? Can you hear me well? Okay. I have this other microphone, and I forget which one it is.
Oh, it's a little bit echoey, so it's probably coming through your non-headset microphone. So if you're close to the other one, that would probably work better.
How does this sound? Does it sound better?
Oh, much better.
I can't believe it. I've done this twice in 2 days. You can hear me, though. I'm glad to hear.
I was wondering why it was so echoey, given that your mouth was like 2 inches from the microphone. So that's much better.
I should have had that with me. This is not all right. So, but you all heard what I was saying. That's good.
Yeah.
So, we put everybody in the same room, and people got along very well. Andrew, I've heard you remark since then that you were surprised, to some extent, to hear, the people there from the PR side, expressing, a more realistic view of Wikipedia than, I don't know what you expected, but that was kind of a lot what I expected, frankly. And because I've had a foot in both worlds for so long. There are bad people on both sides of it. There's a lot of good people on both sides, and I really tried to bring together good people. Part of the goal then was to get the agencies present, see if they were willing to put together a statement of basically, I called it a statement of ethics early on. It kind of evolved to be a statement expressing support for Wikipedia's goals, an interest in understanding it better, acknowledging that even most people in the PR industry do not know a lot about Wikipedia. So calling attention to that fact, I thought was, an important thing. And then, also to follow Wikipedia's guidelines, to observe its terms of use, and to educate clients and colleagues on, undoing the same as well, and acknowledging also that this isn't necessarily the sort of thing that's going to change overnight, but that folks on the PR side are open to a renewed dialogue. And that is the statement we put together from February to late May, and then we spent the last couple weeks planning to get the news out about it. And we've been, for the most part, pretty encouraged by the response, both from first in the PR press, which did a pretty good job of covering it, then in the business press, which did maybe a little bit less good a job of covering it, and it's starting to get into mainstream news. I talked to USA Today today, and so they'll be writing something fairly soon. And on Wikipedia as well, I think it's had a fairly good response. We've had more agencies and professional organizations wanting to join as well. And even Jimmy Wales said he thought that it was a great opportunity. And Jimmy Wales is no one's idea of a fan of public relations, people being on Wikipedia. I think he's encouraged to see them say that they'll follow the terms of use, for one thing, because that's certainly been an issue in the past. And I think that's where we're at the moment. I know that there are others on this panel that have a differing view of the efforts, so I can't wait to get into that.
Right, and just one last little bit before I open up to the panel. I mean, I entered into this conversation fairly open-minded, but also unsure what that meeting was going to be for in February, right? So all I know is that Bill had invited me. There were two other Wikipedia editors there, Jake Orlowitz and James Hare. That's not really a secret. It's just I don't think it was on that page. And I think we weren't really quite sure what to expect. And in fact, I was, as Bill said, I was kind of surprised when I entered the room and we had a very nice, frank discussion that the PR representatives there, and they're, correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, but they're mainly the heads of their either digital or social media practices at those firms.
They tend to be SVP and digital practice chair, or that's kind of the level I was going for.
Right. I mean, I was quite surprised, pleasantly surprised, that these were not necessarily. Well, I was expecting folks who were technically savvy, but were kind of ignorant of Wikipedia's rules and were maybe treating Wikipedia like any other social network that's out there, even though Wikipedia is not a social network. And these folks were quoting policy. They were using the same acronyms that you would find at people at Wikimania or at a meetup. They were saying ANI, AFC, articles creation, all this stuff, and I was shocked. Not really shocked, but I was kind of like pleasantly surprised, saying, okay, these folks spent their time to try to understand the community, and majority, if not all of those folks there said, oh yeah, well, we take a hands-off approach. We really don't feel like editing directly on Wikipedia would be either wise or be in compliance with their policies. And I think that was the most useful thing about that meeting, was that Wikipedians actually took the time to sit down with what were perceived enemies of Wikipedia. And in fact, it was a lot less scary and a lot less onerous than one would think. And in fact, it was refreshing to see that the large firms were more than happy to agree to something like this. And I think it was in their interest because they wanted to draw a line in the sand saying, those Wiki PR folks, those boutique folks who don't really abide by certain guidelines, we're not them. We want to make sure the world knows that the major firms that represent big companies want to work ethically, the same way that they wouldn't violate Facebook's terms of use or Google's terms of use. They're not interested in violating Wikipedia's terms of use. Now, it doesn't mean that the bulk of PR folks now are going to fall in line behind this policy, but it is kind of nice to have a certain type of creed out there, and you can figure out which firms do sign on to it and don't sign on to it, and start to sift through companies that are doing things right and wrong with that statement as a starting point. So that was what I saw as a very useful first step, but I can see why others look at it and say, well, maybe that's not all it's cracked up to be. I just think of it as a nice kind of first foray into having some type of differentiation among folks in the PR world as to what they will or will not abide by in terms of Wikipedia's guidelines. So with that, I'd love to open up to Pete, who actually works in the field of helping companies with their Wikipedia content, and also Tom, as someone from the community. I mean, what is your initial reaction to this? Was it kind of like, nothing burger? Was it great? Was it not so interesting? Pete, you look like you're itching.
Yeah, I'd like to, I think given the subject matter, I think a really good starting point is what has been the public relations impact of this event. And so if we start by looking at the headlines that came that came out in some of these publications, I just want to read a few of them. Ad Age,
with a caveat that like half those headlines I think are completely inaccurate, which just shows you how bad.
Well, what are you doing? You're stealing my thunder, Andrew. But now you've made the point. Okay,
it drives me nuts when journalists can't report well on Wikipedia. It drives me nuts.
Okay, so let me come at this. I wanted to introduce it a different way, but let's come at it a different way then. Yeah. So let's take it as granted that a large number of the headlines are grossly inaccurate, and I will read one of them that just to illustrate the point.
Right.
In the SF Chronicle, major PR firms agree not to edit clients' Wikipedia entries.
Right.
But there is no such agreement, and that's about half of the. I mean, I've got a screenshot here of the Google News search, and about half of the entries from Ad Age, from Inc. magazine, from the San Francisco Chronicle, from Time magazine, get the not just somewhere in the article, but they get the headline wrong. So there's something that it would be very advantageous to the PR industry if it were said about them, which is that if they were going to do something new and bold and different in regards to how they deal with Wikipedia, and if that was something that was popular. And I don't think it's I'm not ascribing ill intent, but I also don't think it's a coincidence that half of the headlines got it wrong. I really wish that that the PR that we had people from Ogilvy or something on this, because I'd be really interested to know, have they contacted those copy editors who wrote those headlines and asked them to correct them, because they're not just wrong in a detail, they're grossly wrong. They're expressing that the PR agencies will not do something that many Wikipedians don't want them to do. So it's a really tantalizing thing. I think basically, bottom line, I just put up a blog post that kind of digs into this. I would say this is exactly what it looks like when the PR industry does its own PR on its own Wikipedia strategy. And this is they have artfully created a media experience that makes it look as though something has been announced. But what it boils down to is, number one, they've said they want to learn about Wikipedia. Number two, they've said that they will obey the rules. Number three, they said that they will obey the rules. And number four, they said that their staff will obey the rules. That's not an announcement. There is nothing announced, but it looks like something was announced. And they did a good enough job of creating that illusion that all of these publications have jumped on board, even to the point of inventing something being announced that actually wasn't announced. And I don't think that's something that we should be celebrating.
Interesting. Bill, any response to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say one of the better headlines, I'm looking at the same Google News. Wall Street Journal says PR firms vow to abide Wikipedia's rules on conflicts. That's true. Times headline is PR firms vow they won't try to game Wikipedia. That is true as well.
That one I think is debatable. It's not the most grossly wrong, but I think that one's debatable.
Interesting.
Where's the vow that they won't game Wikipedia? They've said they'll follow the rules, but you can follow the rules and game something. That's sort of what gaming is.
Well, so
ArtCom shows us that even the volunteers will game Wikipedia if it's in their favor.
And when you have a rule that says ignore all rules, the gaming possibilities are rather extensive.
Yeah, but that's
pretty
nihilistic.
I really don't think they said that they won't game Wikipedia.
Yeah, but the IAR has been kind of not on the books for a long time now, right? You really do have to follow the rules of Wikipedia.
Oh yeah, you can't just.
Well, I'm sorry. I mean, if you're an independent person reading that announcement and they're saying explicitly that they're going to follow Wikipedia policy, and you go to what are the 5 top Wikipedia policies, ignore all rules is there. I mean, it may be that it's not popular to follow that one, or that it's a little challenging, or whatever. But the thing that they've agreed to do includes ignore all rules.
So is that the PR company's fault, or is that can't guarantee you, but I bet you, like, out of I guess we had 7 pure PR people in the room, at least 6 of them probably have never heard of ignore all rules.
Well, so let me also say, I mean, just to go back to, I think earlier, Bill, you said that that a lot of people in the PR industry don't really understand Wikipedia.
True.
And like what popped into my head is, like, if I were running a scouting organization for a baseball league and I didn't really know anything about the Dominican Republic, I would be out of a job.
Right.
I mean, I think you're right about that. I think it's true. But it's preposterous in 2014 that somebody could say that they know, that somebody could run a PR business and not really understand Wikipedia. They shouldn't be jumping up and down and saying, hey, we're willing to learn about it. They should be dedicating staff to learning deeply about it and keeping it quiet that they don't know what the hell's going on.
Funny. I mean, I definitely agree they should be, devoting resources to it. And, we probably at some point should talk more about, and when I say we, I mean the folks who were in that meeting at the Donovan House in February, talk more about some of the things that came out of it. Probably the next big topic of conversation after doing this statement was to appoint someone in-house at these firms to be like the Wikipedia point person, the person who would field requests, who would be knowledgeable. It is just because we agree that there is a lot of ignorance in the PR world. I think it's unfortunate. You say it's preposterous. I say it's actually not terribly surprising to me. I found, you and I are two of the only serious consultants I know that do this sort of thing. It's hard to do. People who would be good at it, Wikipedians, are not terribly interested oftentimes in working on client projects. And people who work on client projects in public relations typically aren't the sort who are going to take the hundreds of hours over a couple of years to learn in depth this particular community. So people like you and me are fairly rare. And a couple of years ago when I kind of set out in business myself, I was afraid early on that people would learn what I did, go, oh, that's a good idea. Well, now that I've learned that there's the basic step process, I'll just go do it. I won't need to hire Bill to talk us through it. And it turns out that I'm still getting business because people still don't get Wikipedia at this point. I would like to educate people better. I do see this as being a two-way education process. One, to educate PR companies about the fact that there is a set of rules they need to follow, and that it is possible to follow them, even if it isn't the most efficient thing. And then the second thing is to educate Wikipedians that there are responsible PR people who can see that there is an overlap. And I would like at some point in the future Wikipedians to say dedicate more resources to helping not just PR folks, not just corporate comms people, but anybody who is outside Wikipedia and has a question about fixing something that's wrong and they don't know how, or they're not allowed to. And allowed to being Brightline, not policy. Hey, if you're right, the statement does not say that PR firms agreed not to edit clients' entries in so many words. However, Wikipedia's own guidelines don't say that. If that is a problem that the PR firms didn't say that, then that would be an issue for Wikipedia's policies and guidelines to address.
I guess also related to that is that the first paragraph mentions crew, right, Bill? And actually, crew's recommendation was don't edit Wikipedia directly, go to the talk page, and here's a whole flowchart. So I guess that's something that could be clarified in a follow-up version of this document, is that there seems to be not in that gray box where you have the exact statement, there doesn't have that context of crew being this ongoing dialogue between Wikipedians and PR folks, and actually the best practices that the crew has is to, in fact, go beyond the COI guidelines of Wikipedia, so it's to not edit directly, right?
Oh, the main thing that I remember about that crew document is that the end of the flowchart literally had the words that were something like, you now have the right to complain about Wikipedia anywhere you want to if you get through the flowchart. And it was not even remotely a professional document. It didn't represent Wikipedia well. It didn't represent the PR industry well. I mean,
Look, you know what?
It was not something that I would ever show to a client, I guess.
What are you comparing it to?
I just think that language like that doesn't. It indicates a sort of level of whimsical attitude towards the whole, towards a serious issue that just isn't appropriate to a professional approach.
As you say that, I follow that. That reflected the sense of humor of one of the people who was principally responsible for it. On reflection, I would like to see a second version of that, one that so I can sign on to that. But nothing of its sort had been made before, just because it is flawed. And maybe it's the same thing with this statement. Just because this statement doesn't go far enough, it's the first time that we've got these agencies on the record as saying.
I'm not sure I would. I mean, I'm not sure I agree that nothing of the kind has been made before, though, because I think that I certainly have many of those kinds of things documented internally, and it's not like a big secret, but I haven't, it just hasn't really been, worthwhile to sort of put the level of polish to put it on out there to the public. But I talk to all my clients about that kind of thing, and what are the things that it makes sense to do? What should you do? That's exactly what I do. Is at this point in the process, what do you do? Do you do you go out and seek input from a wiki project? Do you you fix a typo without pointing it out to someone, just making lots of little judgments like that. And the thing is, the knowledge that I brought to doing that is just the knowledge that I picked up as a regular Wikipedian for years before I ever went into business. So it's all over the place. It's just not. I mean, that maybe was the first broadly published effort to formalize it, but I think there have been many efforts to document that to document pieces of that. And I think one that took an epic tried to draw a complete picture around something that's complex, where there are lots of little places where different Wikipedians might disagree, was sort of was bound to not really be adequate. It's not. It was bound to it was too specific to. I don't know what Wikipedian that didn't have the privilege of being involved in its construction would ever look at it and say, oh yeah, I agree with every step in that flowchart.
Oh, even I think that flowchart is too simplistic. I mean, it's a complicated flowchart, and it really only gets you up to the point where you've made a request, and then what do you do if nobody replies, which is, as you know, it's a serious problem. Yeah, do you go to a wiki project? How do you find an editor who is, to be knowledgeable and, look at it seriously? So the fact that it's not possible to draw a simple step-by-step, process to get things done is why you and I have jobs, I suppose.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Pete,
it is. I mean, the conditions that in a way, are not good for Wikipedia in drawing in. I would say in drawing in new contributors, right? I have no special sympathy for people in the PR industry. I think that we do a terrible job of presenting a coherent site to new contributors to working in, and I would kind of rather see resources dedicated towards systemic bias than towards empowering the people who are on the top of the systemic bias, which is, I think, kind of what the PR industry would be. But
I think it's systemic bias against companies, though. Think about it. Don't think about it in terms of PR. Think about it in terms of companies.
No. I mean, I'm sorry. That was okay. So that what I mean by that point is that in general, throughout society, the people, the organizations, the companies who are able to and have the resources and the desire to hire a PR company, those are the organizations that generally are doing well. And the ones that can't, the startup organizations or the nonprofits that are on a shoestring budget, that can't start, those are the ones that are not represented well. So I think if you put PR and their clients anywhere in the systemic bias,
What are you talking about off Wikipedia? They're well represented in Washington, right? They're well represented in Congress. They're actually not very well represented on sorry, I almost said Facebook. They're almost not very well represented on Wikipedia. There are company articles tend to fall out of date frequently. There's no such restriction on the ideologically motivated critics of those companies from going to edit those articles. And so
there is, because if the ideologically motivated critics have a conflict of interest, they're just as much, there's just as much of a problem there. Which is one of the reasons why drawing the line at paid editing or at the bright line thing that was proposed and failed, as Andrew mentioned, it doesn't get to the core of the problem.
Oh, I completely agree with that. Yeah. At the same time, though, I do actually observe the bright line. I have since early 2012, pretty much even before Jimbo spelled it out. I had a point where somebody yelled at me because I didn't like edits to an article, and at that point in time, I was like, all right, I can still be successful if I tended to go for consensus first and then only edit if it was crickets, and now I don't take crickets as a reason to edit. And I do that because I want to have a long-term association with Wikipedia, and so taking a long-term view. If it's a small thing, I can wait for it to be changed. If it's a large thing, it's going to take a while to work through anyhow. And I can address what I do and what I tell my clients to do. I can't stop, ideologically motivated environmentalist from coming and editing an article about someone in heavy industry that I might be giving advice to, and so I can only do myself. You're right. I don't think the bright line covers everything. I think that part of the statement is to keep this make this conversation a little bit, let's move it forward, because it's a really complicated topic, and I'd like to have a better conversation, I suppose. This is a good one. I don't mean this conversation.
I think the nature of that. I'm just thinking of the PR clients that I've had, because there are PR agencies that I've worked with, over multiple clients.
Sure.
And I think there's a difference in the dynamic because every one of those, they've sought me out when they realized that they were up against something that they didn't know how to solve.
Same here. It's word of mouth. Almost all of my work is word of mouth.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, go for it, Tom.
Well, there's a few interesting things that I see sort of in this document. First of all, that I never would have expected these PR firms to actually send anybody of influence to this meeting. So the fact that they sent their head of social media or their head of new media, or your favorite title is for a social media consultant these days is, it's amazing in my mind that they actually put somebody there that could make some changes.
Yeah.
And I like the idea. I like the idea that PR firms.
Yeah. They're important, but they weren't usually like the top person. Influential though.
But still, they have some sort of sway within their company, and I
they got them to sign on
never would have expected the PR agencies to do that. And
Phil, there's the value. I think. Phil, I called you Pete. Pete, I called you Phil. Sorry.
I missed it though.
Anyway, I'm agreeing with Tom. That's all.
Yeah. Bill just said
there's some big names here.
Yeah, Bill just said that there's the value of having this meeting is to actually get folks who have that influence inside the company. So, Tom, go ahead.
Yeah.
There's some big names here. I don't know anything about PR, but a few of these sound vaguely familiar to me. I'm an undergraduate, so I don't touch PR at all. I would like the PR problem to not be such a divisive thing in the future. It seems to be unnecessarily divisive because I don't see any difference between somebody motivated by making money or the Scientologists or the Falun Gong, I think is how you pronounce it, the Chinese group that's doing lots of advocacy on Wikipedia that ARBCom is looking at again. I don't see any difference between them and the company. Why do we single out
agree with that.
people that try to do the right thing?
Yeah, let me add a common misconception that I see. Common misconception is... Do we have a delay here? We must have a delay. Here, Tom, I'll kick back to you in a moment. But you actually touched on a thing that I think is a common misconception, which is interesting, and that is that that big business or PR companies just have unlimited budgets to throw at an issue. That's definitely not the case, I can tell you. Otherwise, I would be making more money than I am. And it's people who are ideologically motivated who will stick with it. They're not operating on a budget. They're operating on, a sense of mission. And so you definitely can deplete a company's budget by continuing to stand against them, and they may just decide that it's not worth the headache anymore. That's all I'm going to say.
That's understandable.
I think just to come back to the head of social media question, I think there's a interesting maybe point for discussion there. When I started out doing this kind of work, I sort of made the assumption. I kind of started off reaching out to people in social media areas, and it kind of clicked for me a couple years ago that I think actually the term that I've started using when I talk to people from the PR world is that Wikipedia really is fundamentally, it is not social media. That social media is very much about, when you talk about Facebook and YouTube and Flickr, and you're talking about things where you establish a channel for yourself, and there might be some really, there might be some lines you can't cross as far as like, nudity or obscenity or, stuff like that. But for the most part, you're just allowed to do whatever you want within your channel, and then you reap the benefits of doing it well, or you pay the price of doing it badly. And Wikipedia is fundamentally different than that model. And so what I try to talk about is Wikipedia as a, granted, really unusual, but it's a form of earned media, because that's a term that people in the PR world are familiar with. And they would never think to lump, working towards getting a really good piece of coverage in the New York Times in the same bucket with managing a Twitter feed. It's just like they're so completely different. But I think that like Wikipedia, it's about persuasion. It's about persuasion and maintaining your integrity while you're doing that persuasion. So like with like the relationship that a PR company might build up with a reporter, they might want to spin their story for the New York Times reporter. But if they try too hard to spin it, or if they like call them too many times, or if they feed them lies or something like that, that New York Times reporter isn't going to talk to them the next time they want a story. So there's sort of this, there's this, it's like there's an equilibrium that they have to maintain where there's an incentive for them to conduct themselves with integrity. And I think Wikipedia is much better viewed in that model. It's not moralizing. It's not like be good because otherwise you're bad and we hate you. It's be good because that's in your client's best interest in the long term.
Right. That's a great point, Pete. And that's something that since 2003, when I first started doing academic research, I called Wikipedia, the most participatory journalistic enterprise on the net, because it is that relationship, that earning of that credibility. But here's the problem, I think, that I'm hopeful that this statement tries to help address in some way, is that we actually do have, as Bill mentioned before, a systemic bias within Wikipedia against companies, like actively looking to, I want to say actively, but consciously letting...
Active neglect?
Yeah, it's kind of like active neglect. It's like intentionally letting those articles suck in Wikipedia. And it's almost like this indie media streak in Wikipedia of sticking it to the man. And you have to admit it's there. That the fact is that there's a lot more passion.
Right, and I think I absolutely do admit it's there, and I encounter it on a daily basis. But I don't think I think that a better path to getting past that is not to say that it's for the PR industry, is not to say we will do things well. It's to do things well and build a track record, and just it's to roll up your sleeves and get to work and not worry about what it looks like for a while.
No, I think it's got to go both ways.
The internal knowledge and the track record that shows up in the edit history that makes it possible for Wikipedians to start imagining what it looks like to work with, a corporate person with integrity. Right. Because so many Wikipedians just can't even imagine that because they've never encountered it.
Right. Before the statement, it basically was this weird Cold War where there was no dialogue, there was no channel of communication, right? So the article sucked. The Wikipedians suspected PR folks are going behind the scenes with sock puppets or Odesk freelancers to change articles and stuff like that. This helps make that more explicit, saying that big guys and their clients are not doing that. They agree not to do that. So they've said, okay, these corporate articles may suck. We're agreeing not to surreptitiously or behind the scenes to fix that. Now, the ball's in the Wikipedians' court is my attitude. Like, the Wikipedians have now got to step up and say either, okay, are we going to come up with something like BLP for corporations? Like, is it not only unethical to leave crap articles in crap state, but it's also just bad for Wikipedia's reputation to leave crap articles in crap state, especially since these articles are not low traffic articles. These are fairly high traffic articles about Fortune 500 companies and things like that. So I'm not saying that I'm weeping for these large companies that have multi-billion-dollar budgets and everything, but we have, as Wikipedians, kind of neglected this thing for a long time, and we just kind of shrug and say, who is it harming really? Well, we're 4.5 million articles into this project. I think it's about time we kind of step up to the plate and say we've got to try to counteract that part of the systemic bias, not only female scientists and the gender gap, but this one particular thing. I think something needs to be done here. I don't know if you agree or not, but that's how
I do. I absolutely agree that something needs to be done. I just don't think that this path leads to anything. I don't think it leads to something effective being done. So in the work that I do, every client that I have completes one of our engagements with a better understanding of Wikipedia and a better understanding of etiquette on Wikipedia, a better understanding of like how to not be a jerk on Wikipedia. You know, of like if I want to, and they probably, like most of my clients, it's like they've been through the exercise, and you know 6 months go by and they have something else they want to do, they're probably going to call me again. They haven't developed like enough of a level of confidence to do it. But part of that is because they've developed a sophisticated enough understanding that like, oh wow, like, you know, I had a client the other day who I have worked with multiple times, and for I think the third time she submitted a draft to me that had the word solutions in the, you know, this blah blah blah, this you know, this is a company that makes you know, like data transmogrification solutions for blah blah blah. Like we've discussed this like 3 times before. Just call it a product.
Right.
You call it a solution, and you're immediately gonna get, like, any Wikipedian's gonna look at that and be like, oh, this was written by a marketing person.
Right.
You know, and
It's hard,
it's not. It's I mean, in a way, like if it was only that word, you know, then it wouldn't be a big deal. You just go in and you change it. But I know that that's going to be the thing that's going to kind of trigger the negative reaction that you're talking about, Andrew, in a lot of people. And they're not going to look at something in a, you know, and they're not going to recognize that maybe there actually has been a lot of work to only put really high quality sources in there and to like weed out all the press releases and all that junk before even submitting it. You know, and it just makes for a nicer interaction.
You know, it's our job to save our clients from themselves.
I'm sorry?
It's our job to save our clients from themselves.
Exactly.
I mean, here's a simple thing I see that statement doing, right? And the reason why is because before the statement, there was this kind of assumed bad faith climate around PR companies or communications professionals. And with the statement by saying these firms and these people at these firms who've signed on to it to help enforce it at their firms tries to establish the marker back in the middle as an assumed good faith position. That's my feeling, is that, okay, so maybe now with these statements, at least those employees at Edelman and Ogilvy and all the folks who signed on, we can at least start with an AGF stance. Whereas before, we basically said, oh, anyone even with a whiff of PR, we're going to assume you're a shill, you can't edit neutrally, you are trying to game the system here and there. So I think this goes a ways to help reset the marker somewhere. Doesn't mean that they're good guys, doesn't mean that they're going to always act in the best interest of Wikipedia, but I think it just resets the relationship at a place so we can start having that conversation again. And that's where I seize the value.
I doubt it.
I'm not saying it's a guaranteed thing, but
well, I think it's something that we should come back and look at. You know, if there's a way to come back in 6 months and even develop a gut sense of whether that dynamic has shifted, that would.
But Tom, I'd be interested in hearing what you think. I mean, what we see in Wikipedia is what happens in my world of journalism. You know, when they tarnish news media as liberal news media, this is a type of stuff that is a problem, right? That the traditional news media sticks up for the little guy, and then when it comes to the Monsantos and Exxons of the world, you let them have it. So it's your typical, you know, comfort the afflicted, afflict the comfortable type of relationship. And Wikipedia is flogging the comfortable by letting these Wikipedia articles rot in crappy states with inaccurate information, with sections that are extremely long about the bad environmental record of BP or Exxon or these folks. Not that they don't deserve most of that, but it really is unbalanced at this point. So, Tom, what do you see? I mean, is there a way out of this? Is there a way to have the community either step up to get rid of the systemic bias or address it in some way?
I don't really think so. I mean, the community. So I'm thinking in a few ways here. I'm thinking recent changes patrolling, where you have fairly new editors who like tagging everything as A12, which is, this is a PR piece, it must be burned with fire. And there are lots of things, that's a wide net. And the average admin that patrols that whole section, it thinks it catches everything. So we would need to retrain most of our admins to say, if this is on the fence, maybe you should actually put in some time and work on Article X. I think that the community, the WikiPR thing destroyed any goodwill that the community has because it wasted so many man hours, and we've lost several high-profile functionaries and other members just became burnt out because of that. So I don't think that in six months will change anything. Maybe, though, if the PR people work beside us and we're all working towards the same goal, that in a year or two we might see some sort of turnaround. But this is Wikipedia, which isn't that good at changing itself.
It's like the Titanic, or not Titanic. Sorry, it's like a large ship that takes a while to turn. That was totally the wrong metaphor. Or Freudian slip. Which was it? No. So, I mean, you're right. I think 2 years is probably a better time frame for which to judge this. In the signpost this week, either out now or shortly to come out, the very first question that Jake Orlowitz asks me is, is this just PR? And I think that if this is the last time you hear about it, then I would concede the point. But this really is supposed to be just a first public step, sort of like a throat clearing to say, I definitely disagree with Pete to say that that this is not news to be said. There is this perception that PR is just out to game Wikipedia, and so I think it is useful to put these agencies on the record to say that is not their intention. I don't think they are playing the same game of parsing.
Can I ask you on that? Can I ask you a question on that?
Yeah.
What exactly what do you like? So Andrew brings up the possibility of a Wikipedian holding one of these PR companies accountable to their words in this document.
Yeah.
What exactly do you imagine? What is a scenario in which as we discussed before, at least like Tom and I think that gaming Wikipedia while still following policy is very much possible. So them asserting that they haven't followed policy. I'm sorry?
I think that would be very much grounds for criticism.
But let me just make it a very specific question. So if what they have done is agree, it sounds like a joke, but I'm really serious. Like the 4 or 5 points they've made are they say they're going to learn about Wikipedia, they're going to obey the existing rules, they're going to obey the existing rules, they're going to have their staff obey the existing rules, and then maybe number 5. They're going to advocate for other people to do all that stuff. Where in there is there something to which you can hold them accountable? Where have they said, we will not game the system? Or where have they said, we will not edit articles directly? Or any specific thing where someone could point to a statement and say, you said you wouldn't do this, but you're doing it. I mean, apart from disobeying the terms of use, which already is something that they could get in trouble with because they agree to the terms of use just by using the site.
Sure. Well, there are a lot of policies and guidelines that are very likely to be tripped over and are tripped over all the time. So that I would say is they're not in there, but policies and guidelines.
But the terms of use say that you have to follow policy. That's in the new terms of use.
Okay. I mean,
so that's they've already
see,
agreed to that by using the site.
Well, maybe in this way, this is still maybe this is public relations, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that point. I still think it's a useful thing to do. I think it's useful to put agencies on the record in a very public way, saying that their intention is to, and let me go quote here, the fact to have them say that they view Wikipedia, as unique. It's in the best interests of the industry and Wikipedia users that Wikipedia be accurate, objective. If they're trying to game the system, they would then be trying to make it, less objective. And the truth of the matter is that Wikipedia has so many topics that are in the eye of the beholder that the fact that there's not like one thing in here that you can necessarily point to and aha, you stepped over that line. Unfortunately, that is because Wikipedia itself is this big amorphous mass of facts and opinion sourced to reliable sources, and I think the important thing to do is look at the spirit of it, rather than to get legalistic.
Well, no, I don't think it is the spirit of it because when you have like Wikipedia getting having useful information get to the public about Wikipedia through the press is a rare thing. Is a thing that we should crave, right? We should, if the public is not entirely informed about Wikipedia, if the public has legitimate questions about Wikipedia, it is very every opportunity to get a story into the mainstream or business press or whatever and advance a message that's useful to that is a really valuable opportunity. This announcement, I mean, I advise my client, it is a good thing, right? I advise every single one of my clients clearly assert that you support Wikipedia's values, policies, what it's like, like take your pick. I have them put it in their own words. It's very useful to have people, but it's one of a number of different steps I have them take, and it's hardly the most important. So for them to do that, and suddenly we've got, I don't know, has anyone counted? Like we've got like 30 mainstream sources, Time Magazine, USA Today. You know how hard it was for me to get an op-ed in USA Today about something that I think actually was important to Wikipedia? Like Inc., Advertising Age, there's all this press around as though there was something that something significant in the way that the PR industry is relating to Wikipedia that happened, but when you dig just a little below the surface, there's nothing there, and that's a big opportunity cost.
I think that's really unfair. I mean, you got to know that the first time something ever happens is newsworthy, right? So off the bat, you have to see that that's notability in terms of whether this should be covered or not. Second of all, I think it's kind of weird to argue, yes, they've pledged to, act in accordance with Wikipedia's policies and guidelines, but what if they don't? I mean, it's pretty clear in this bullet number 2. They says we want to act in accordance with Wikipedia's policies and guidelines. I don't think it gets any more direct than that. They're not cherry picking which one. It does say that particularly those related to COI, but it says that we are pledging to act in accordance with Wikipedia's policies and guidelines. This is the first ever that we've had these PR companies actually come out and say, you know what, of all this unknown weird battle conditions we've had in our industry with Wikipedia, we are trying to clear the air here and say we, these named folks, are in fact declaring that we're not one of those folks. So I think that's newsworthy. I certainly do think it warrants some kind of coverage.
Yeah, as well, I think the fact that it acknowledges the quote challenging relationship that the industry and the community have is something that they've never said in public before. And I know that's an issue that came up when we were working with the drafts of the statement between the folks representing the Wikipedia side and folks representing the agency side. There were some people on the agency side that were uncomfortable with that because they did not want to be in the position of apologizing for things that their firms did not do or may not have done, and that they, again, like WikiPR is a company that they do not see as being a peer of their own. And so
I think to say that directly would be much, much more valuable. For a coalition of PR agencies to say we abhor this practice of creating sleeper sock puppet accounts and doing all this stuff, and we distance ourselves from it. That would be useful because that actually conveys some specific meaning, and that that actually that actually sends a message to those entities that they're marginalizing themselves by making those choices within their industry.
I think they got that message. I'm aware that there are some firms that didn't sign it because they were uncomfortable with that line. They thought that they would put them on the hook for apologizing for that. So I think I also say in that interview with Jake that I know there will be folks that think this goes too far in some ways, and some that don't think it goes far enough, and I'm willing to deal with that. I also agree that this alone is not so newsworthy. And maybe I'll disagree with Andrew slightly here. I actually don't think that this necessarily puts the Wikipedia community on notice that now it needs to step up. I think this is a first statement from the PR firms that, like, hey, we recognize that there is not a great deal of trust between us and you. We would like to change that. Here is us saying that we'd like to change that. And I wouldn't judge the PR industry entirely based on this statement. I straddle both worlds as you do too. So it's when I say us, sometimes I mean one, sometimes I mean the other. This is us saying that judge us by our future actions. This is like planting a flag and saying we want to do better. Here's us starting to do better.
Strangely enough, Bill, I agree with your disagreement with me, yet I still maintain my previous view, which is basically, here's how I explain it. By explain it as this détente, I hope, which comes with this statement, means that Wikipedians can no longer make the excuse that we're not helping out these articles because we're aware that these PR companies are trying to unfairly influence them. So it's less of a right of the corporations to have better articles, but it's more of a challenge to Wikipedians now, saying that you probably could have made the excuse for the last 10 years that because we felt we were under assault and we were outgunned and outmanned and outplayed not even outplayed, but we're being played by sock puppets and all these different things that we've had to basically, not put all our attention on improving those articles, but just defending those articles. But I think the onus is now on Wikipedians to actually improve those articles to make sure they're of high quality. Like every article of a company that's in the Fortune 500 should have a good article that balances out what they're known for and what they're notorious for. And right now, I don't think that's the case.
How are we going to measure progress on that? Like how I mean, I don't buy into the hypothesis that that's going to start getting better, but I'm very willing to entertain that maybe I'm wrong.
I don't either. No. I'm very pessimistic. But if you look at
but I thought but I mean I think that's like let's dig into that a little bit, because I thought what you were saying was that this announcement was something that could shift that dynamic and make things start to get better. But
I mean,
if it's
could,
is that going to be something that there's any way to measure?
It's one of those necessary but not sufficient things. So I think the groundwork is there, or the underlying groundwork is there. But I think you need to revive things like Wiki Project corporations, which we kind of took a look at, I think, at this conference, and it's basically no one participating in it.
Or Wiki Project Business. Wiki Project Business.
See, that's something that I would think, like, there would be something, again, I think meaningful that the PR industry could do is, like, if they, were to commit to, I mean, if they wanted to, like, hire someone to kind of barn raise a wiki project. Wiki projects are really hard to get going.
Right. Yeah. That's something that there was some brainstorming on. Like, what if there was some way to fund a neutral pool of editors to help improve them, but not necessarily be an advocate for any one particular corporation, but just advocate for better balance in all those articles, right? Whether it's a Wikipedian in residence.
So just generic paid Wikipedia editors? I was thinking more like paid sort of community space builder or manager, or someone to sort of facilitate discussion, not to write articles.
Yeah, there's no real good obvious role or obvious solution for that. Yeah, it could be a facilitator, but doesn't do any direct editing. It could be someone who just does research on it and just says, okay, let's look at the Fortune 500, just give you the status of each of these Fortune 500 companies in terms of...
there are great models for that. They've been the subject of research of, like, kind of what people have done in successful wiki projects to make them hum. Right?
That's right.
This is not unknown information.
That's right. So they're
be military history or medicine.
What's that?
Be military history, roads, medicine, or what's the other big one?
Chemistry,
tropical
mathematics.
cyclones.
I like to say Oregon.
Well, I mean, that's the problem, is trying to find a passionate community around improving the articles of multi-billion-dollar corporations. We're just not seeing that. No, we haven't seen it in 10 years. Folks passionate about making sure these super rich companies get a fair shake in Wikipedia. It just doesn't happen organically.
But we do know that there are things that can be done, just like by running a collaboration of the week program. There is research that proves that has an impact on making a wiki project more effective.
Right. It could be like
I don't think anyone would object to the PR industry, like, putting someone in to, like, just maintain a collaboration of the week program and, like, create a page where other people can suggest.
Plenty of Wikipedians who complain about that.
Well, there are ways that you could do it, that you could overrun those.
Yeah.
It's pretty damn easily.
I mean, some of the things we brainstormed as well is, what if you had a Wiki Education Foundation or a Wiki Education program engagement with a B school, so that B school students actually helped to edit at least the fundamentals or the Wikidata stuff related to these companies, right? That might be an interesting thing. But Go ahead, Tom.
That's actually what I was thinking, Andrew, is that we have how many hundreds of thousands of business school students, both graduate and undergraduate? I mean, that's one of the biggest majors at my college, and we're tiny. So that's a potential. But the other thing is the public policy initiative comes to mind, where you can borrow and raise a wiki project, but it doesn't last too long. Because look now at Wiki Project public policy, and you have almost nothing.
That was never, as actually the person who established that was never designed to be. That was never intended to be a lasting thing, which maybe was a design error. But we didn't really try to create a lasting community with that. But I have actually been working to create a lasting community with Wiki Project Open through the work I've been doing with Communicate OER. In the last couple of years, and so it's been fairly active. I don't know, we're just winding down that grant right now. We'll see, we'll see how successful we are, but I feel good about it. we've definitely attracted some new Wikipedians that use that as a pretty central resource to coordinate.
So something I want to make sure folks knew about is that at Wikimania in August, we are planning to have a session talking about this statement, but also really lucky to have it based in UK, because UK was kind of the genesis of a lot of this stuff. In fact, we kind of inadvertently pissed off the UK folks because the Chartered Institute for Public Relations has been working on something like this. And in fact, I think just 2 weeks before today, they actually released 2.0 of their Wikipedia best practices document, which is good. I mean, that's the basis of a lot of this stuff, which is to keep a hands-off approach and to not employ the dark arts to edit Wikipedia.
I would like to add that it's funny that Wikipedians who may have had some role in that process were the ones who were ticked off about it, whereas the two guys that we've talked to in the last couple of days from CIPR, they rather quickly signed on to the statement. Like as of Tuesday, they were on the same day they heard about it. I had been communicating with them prior to this point, and I said to them on an email, "Hey, I definitely never meant to, slight your efforts. I really do like your best practices document." And they were like, "Oh, don't worry about it. No, it was good. They're glad to be on board." So I thought it was funny that CIPR didn't feel slighted at all.
Right, it was one of the
UK people
in the UK that worked a lot of hours on that, and I think they deserve a lot of credit. In fact, all my talks about PR and Wikipedia, I always mention CIPR and UK chapter folks first, because they were the pioneers in this area. But what I'd love to hear Pete's views on are what I hope we can discuss at Wikimania, which is that we are talking about norms in English Wikipedia, right, of being very strict about this.
We better discuss it now, because I won't be at Wikimania.
Right. But the funny thing is that on the mailing list, you had folks from Swedish Wikipedia chime in and said, "Oh, by the way, you should know, we completely support corporate representatives editing Wikipedia directly. Like, we don't mind the IKEA corporate representatives editing the IKEA article." So that would be a shock to most English language Wikipedians. But their argument is that. What's that?
The German language Wikipedia has a flag for all corporate editors where you can go on their profile, and it's just like check user oversight or administrator. It's just attached to their account that they're a PR person, and everyone knows that.
That's right.
They might get something or other for that role-wise, or.
And so that's what's going to be interesting to figure out. Now that we have at Wikimania, I believe for the first time ever, a big open session on paid editing and what it means and what the context is, what can we learn or not learn? I mean, this is not to say that we should say, oh, Swedish can do it, we're definitely can do it here. That doesn't mean that. But how have they dealt with this issue, and why can they do what they do with a different set of concerns than an English Wikipedia?
I think it's a really compelling question, and I do wish that I was there to dig into it a bit more. But I think it also really, like, the place where my mind goes the quickest with that is that is like it is one of many, many, many compelling questions about what are the editorial practices, what are the social norms, etc., of the multiple language Wikipedias, of the different projects that we have, and really, to me, I think the Wikimedia Foundation has, I would think, would be the natural entity to make sure that there is a growing kind of global understanding of what the social dynamics around Wikipedia are. But the Wikimedia Foundation, especially through the narrowing focus document, and especially through the hiring of a product manager, which was Lila Tretikov's background, has really put the focus on technology, not on developing, not on looking at social and editorial norms. And I would think a discussion like this, ideally, in the ideal world, I would love to see it happen in a context of some shared knowledge around what are the differences in general between the German Wikipedia, the Swedish Wikipedia, the English Wikipedia, how their editorial practices have evolved, and that the PR component would be one of many, many, many different things. How do they engage with universities? How easy is it for new contributors to get involved? There are 1,000 questions, that could relate to that, and PR, the PR industry is just one of many. It's not that it's not interesting, but I don't see it as like sort of the top tier one.
Pete, one of my dreams would be the Wikimedia Foundation or somebody else pay a group of about 5 cultural anthropologists just to go through and interview people from every Wikipedia, sit down, get
did it
sort
once.
of what the
They did something kind of like that
are.
once. Yeah.
But you need to do that every few years. Internet cultures change so quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to probably get so let's put it this way. I'm an anthropology philosophy double major. My senior thesis is most likely going to be on Wikidata, looking at the culture of that project. It's been approved by my department. I'm working through IRB at the moment and research committee.
Which means that you might have to not participate in this podcast anymore after that? I'm just kidding.
No.
Okay, good.
Because we don't touch Wikidata at all. So, I mean...
I look forward to hearing more about that. That sounds like a great project.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I would love the foundation sort of to get that idea that we need to figure out what the culture of each project is, because they're all different. Each language, the Wikipedia versus the Wiki News versus the Wikiversity, all have a slightly different culture. What do those look like? Because I think some of our staff
and within even a bigger project like English Wikipedia or many others, it might be much better understood as a lot of overlapping subcommunities. I don't really think there is such a thing as a Wikipedia community. It's or not. I think the much more useful thing is like if you look at Wiki Project Medicine, you're going to have a very different experience than if you look at people who are like looking for typos in the Guild of Copy Editors or something like that. I think those are kind of more like the word community applies better at that scale.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you could do a whole PhD dissertation on just the English Wikipedia, I think.
Or just one little section of it, yeah.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of dissertations to be written.
But I think that's I mean, Tom, I'm in complete agreement with you. I mean, there should be a standing research team just, full-time employed to help the community understand itself. And
to facilitate the community kind of telling each other about, right? It's like some of it is to do the research and some of it is to build an environment in which the Wikipedians are doing the like talking across the chasms.
Right. I mean, the funny thing is, even back in 2005, I had an inkling of this as a necessary thing when, at the first Wikimania, my research student, Kathy Ma, I don't know if any of you have ever met her, but she's really smart, and she was doing her master's thesis on Wikipedia and Barnstars and things that people badge themselves on their homepage or their user page. And she had made the assumption that, in the English Wikipedia, which is correct, that people give each other Barnstars, freely. And then one of the Portuguese Wikipedians in 2005, mind you, very early on, said, "Wait a minute, how can you give each other Barnstars?" And she goes, "Well, you just edit their page." And he goes, No. In Portuguese Wikipedia, we have a very formal process of proposing someone to get a Barnstar, and it gets discussed and voted and everything. It's like, what the hell are you guys doing there in Portuguese Wikipedia? You've completely taken the Barnstar as a freely given gift of charity, of friendliness, and you've turned it into a highly selective award with a nomination process and like RFA almost, which was just fascinating. And we had no idea except for that one little guy who stood up and raised his hand. And we just need more and more methodical study of how these different communities have taken different parts of the wiki culture and embraced it and turned it into different things. And we can learn a lot from each other in this process, right? And we just don't have a methodical way of discovering that, except for the serendipity at Wikimania of learning from each other.
I might actually be citing that article in my lit review. I have a folder full of articles on Wikipedia.
Kathy Moss.
Yeah. So that name sounds familiar. So
and once
it's a small world.
If that could be done again, which I think is a terrific idea, it'd be interesting to and so whether that's on the fact that the Swedish and the German Wikipedias have a different view on on paid contributions, or the Barnstars in Brazil. It'd be interesting to compare that to cultural differences off Wikipedia, because, and I bet that probably is really rather difficult to do, but I just think of the fact that if something is controversial off of Wikipedia, whether that's the Israel-Palestine issue, whether that is the Senkaku Islands, whether that's Northern Ireland, that has a Wikipedia counterpart. So these different cultural artifacts on Wikipedia come from somewhere in culture, and that could be a very difficult line to thing to draw, but it'd be interesting to try.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to see someone with more knowledge than me, maybe at Wikimania we can figure this out, is whether the EU's general attitude of more oversight of the behavior of corporations might have something to do with this.
That's
right?
a fascinating theory, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Bill and I think we've talked about this, or even some of the other participants have talked about this, that because the EU takes a much more heavy-handed approach on the behavior of corporations, whether it's reporting on whether they use GMOs or Microsoft, whether they're bundling the browser or not, you might actually have this sort of Damocles from EU on top of these companies to make sure they're behaving well on Wikipedia or online services, and whether they're actually gaming the system, right? So that might have something to do with the fact that Swedish and German and French Wikipedias are opening their doors to corporate representatives because they actually have other things to threaten corporations with if they misbehave on Wikipedia. You got to remember, Microsoft changed their behavior not because the U.S. government forced them to, it's because the EU forced them to unbundle stuff and to change their behavior. So that'd be kind of interesting to find out whether that was part of the dynamic of these language editions of Wikipedia in the EU, allowing for more engagement with corporations.
And it makes perfect sense when you compare that back to the way it works in the U.S., where companies are less regulated, and so with more of a libertarian society, it requires you to use your head a little bit more and rely on your own skepticism. I think it does encourage skepticism, and that skepticism then translates to the English Wikipedia, where corporations are like our culture. If you watch Comedy Central, if you watch a lot of television, there is a lot of skepticism of watch Hollywood. They always make corporate villains are the new Nazis, basically. And not even new. This has been the case for a while. It's the Soviets, the Nazis, and big business. And on Wikipedia, there is perhaps a healthy fear. I do think it is a healthy fear of companies who might try to do the wrong thing. Certainly, they have a lot tried to do the wrong thing in the past. And I think, but I would love to talk to somebody from Europe who might know more about that, that aspect of European culture.
I think there's just a reality that that dealing with Wikipedia as a PR agency, for a client, like that it's just in the long run, it's not a good idea to be deceptive. And the way that I make that case to my clients is generally like, if they're trying to push for something that feels like it's leaning towards bias to me, the main thing I'll say to them is like, well, what do you want? And we got this 2-month, 3-month project, whatever we're doing. A year, 2 years from now, when you come back, do you want to see what you put up there pretty much still there intact, or do you want to see something with banners up at the top and some of your stuff has been hacked up and removed and and they think, well, yeah, sure, I'd like to have the thing that I put up there. And it's like, well, then why don't you say who you are and put up a version that's as neutral as you can possibly manage, that like is at the low end of what is acceptable to you on the sort of how much is it praising my company, and so I think that's the best long-term strategy. And I think that like the wiki PRs of the world and everything, like it's made a big splash, but like I don't think there was really any chance ever that was going to become the established best practice of the biggest, most serious, biggest reputation PR companies, because they don't want to create that risk on behalf of their clients that something's going to get found out and then it's going to be a huge scandal that's on the front page of every newspaper all over the world.
No, but I do think that by not addressing it, by not having put anything on the record in the past, means that there would be, let's say, letting 1,000 mini wiki PRs bloom. If those companies didn't have an explicit policy of, and while I acknowledge that it doesn't say hands off in the statement, trust me, all of the conversation around it, maybe one reason why you see that in headlines is because the conversation that's surrounding it is just that. Like in the email discussions from people in that group, there is a pretty wide consensus among them, as Andrew said early on, that they tell people inside their company to, stay the heck off Wikipedia because they don't know what they're doing. I do think you're mischaracterizing things badly when you say that this is like there is some wiki lawyering going on, and they're saying the bare minimum that they have to, and then they're planning to go game it.
No.
Yeah.
As I see it, there are two possibilities, right? And
Okay.
and I'm not saying that one is more likely than the other. Like
Mhm.
one possibility is that what they meant to say is that they will never edit articles directly. And the other possibility is that is more that it was like either consciously or less consciously sort of deceptive. Was like, you know,
Okay.
we're just saying that we'll follow policy, and you know they're getting the benefit. But even in the first case, if the intention was to
Right.
say that they don't, you know, that they will not edit articles directly,
Mhm.
why did they not say we will not edit articles directly? That's a
I can
different
answer that.
kind of
So I can
problem.
answer that. I was there for these conversations, so I can break the mystery. Here's the thing. Like I said, it is best practices. Oftentimes I will say, in the current environment, you should not edit Wikipedia directly. It is not, however, the policies or the guidelines. And in the future, there could be a policy or guideline set, and it could go one way or the other. We can't read the future. Um, the point being that if the companies here said we will never edit Wikipedia directly, and then in the future the best practices, the community took a different point of view, maybe went toward more of the European style, then what do they do? Like go back and change that? That would be, I mean, while it could be done, it would seem sort of like poor planning, or it would seem strange to have staked out the strong position and then have to roll it back. That would be a PR nightmare as well. So this is a call to Wikipedia to say, and remember, Jimmy welcomed this, and I've seen other Wikipedia editors who are a little more skeptical of PR people welcoming it. I think it's because they're looking forward to the terms of use being updated, and they think that that will force these companies to either be as transparent as possible or stay the hell away.
Does
And
anyone know, by the way, if that amendment passed? It was on the agenda in May, and Jimmy has talked as though it passed on his talk page, but
he's
I
very
haven't
bullish
seen
on
an
it.
official announcement.
Yeah, he's very bullish on it, but I do not know the answer, and I don't think
Okay.
anyone outside the board, they
Yeah.
know they're
The
not
board
talking.
hasn't published anything yet. I was on WikimediaFoundation.org today
Okay.
looking at board
Good.
resolutions, and
Thank
they
you.
didn't say anything.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at that in the last week or so. So thank you. I'm glad for that update.
So yeah, I understand your point. I think if the policies and guidelines said do not edit Wikipedia, this statement would have complied with that. But as long as it's not in the policies and guidelines, these agencies are open to intend to follow Wikipedia's rules. To say that they would follow best practices, I think would be more of a meaningless statement, because best practices are something that is
Right.
determined.
I think that's something that's meaningful, and I don't think like a big announcement, but
Yeah.
more like an incremental, like this, like little blog posts about little topics would probably be more useful. Would be like specific, what, like in this kind of situation, what is the
Yeah.
best practice? To me, like this document is like, it's not best practices. It's like the very, very baseline.
Yes, I agree with that.
It's very
Completely right.
Yeah.
It's just I love that idea, actually. Your idea there that these agencies should continue to talk about this issue and maybe write blog posts focusing on specific.
Well, you've been doing it. I've been doing it. Why wouldn't they do it?
No, I think they should. I think that's something that I would like to, push more. And why do we do it? Because we focus on this a lot. And for them, it is the sort of thing that they don't do as often. I expect you and I, we both said so. Those large agencies will contract out to specialists like us because they don't have that kind of expertise in-house, and it's relatively uncommon expertise. I think that here we are, 13, 14 years into Wikipedia's existence, that you'll see more of it, but it's just so difficult. And Wikipedia has never been very welcoming. That's another reason why there are so few of us. Changing that culture is important. Showing the community that PR wants to get it right, telling Wikipedia that telling PR there is a way to get it right. I think these are valuable. I think PR, just because the statement itself might be PR, is not a reason to dismiss it by itself. That can be useful. Got to change the conversation, change the tone.
Yeah, no, I'm not anti-PR. I think PR is fine, but I think that this particular case gives us a glimpse of what happens when PR does end in a misleading situation where there's a lot of bad information out there.
It's getting ahead of itself.
Well, to be fair, I mean, as I said, the mainstream media, the way they report on Wikipedia is already pretty bad in the first place. And then on top of that, journalists trying to understand a new facet to something they've never covered before. Teaching journalism for over 10 years, I hate to say it, but it's par for the course. That the majority of headlines are going to just get it wrong because the journalists just read into it what isn't there, or read into it what they want to see, and that's just bad.
So do any of you have insight? Do any of you have insight into whether the Ogilvy Group has or might reach out to those journalists and point it out to them?
I think
if they're trying to get across a clear message and the wrong message is getting across, like I would think that's a moment where you make sure that at the bare minimum that the reporter and the copy editor know what they got wrong, and hopefully you get a correction. I mean, when it's in the headline, that's
They're having a lot of back and forth on a number of those stories between individuals on that mailing list that we have of the original Donovan House people and those media organizations. Sometimes they've changed them very quickly. Sometimes they haven't changed them at all. But I think what you brought up, Pete, is absolutely a great next step, which is to actually look critically at Crew as a group that has established a pretty good flowchart. As you said, maybe it's a little too flippant at the end.
I would disagree with pretty good. Honestly, I know that some of you worked on it here, but I think that it's too. I think it took on something that is. I totally understand the reasoning for wanting to do it, but I think it was too prescriptive. It was too specific about specific steps. I think that kind of thinking is good to do, like talking through different kinds of scenarios and looking at lessons that have been learned from specific situations and looking for patterns and documenting patterns. That's all great stuff to do. But I think trying to build a flowchart that's going to be that's going to allow you to go from one step to the next, and it's going to be useful to a new marketing intern or to like a CEO of a PR agency, or that's going to speak to all these different kinds of audiences and different layers, and how well they know Wikipedia and stuff is. I think it's a little bit doomed at this stage. I think that would be.
I see it as a
lot of like component work that would need.
I see it as a basic skeleton and framework. It is not certainly the last word on how you should engage Wikipedia. But even if you look at that thing and you think, oh, it's too simplistic, that's a damn complex flowchart, which shows you how tough it is to break into this community to figure out all the things. I mean,
yeah,
look,
if what you're trying to illustrate is just that it's complex and perilous, then sure, it does a good job of that much.
But look,
a more accurate version would be about 450 million individual panels.
Right.
Look, I've been editing since 2003. I still have to ping young, recent editors to ask them, what does this acronym mean? Like, what's the norm at AFC, at Articles Creation? Because it didn't exist when I started editing. And I got to say, I kind of tuned out on a lot of the specifics of policy for the last 3 or 4 years. So even myself, I've written a book about it. I teach it. I edit. Yeah. I can't wrap my arms around the whole thing at this point. So I can't imagine what a PR professional who does this as part of their job can do to understand it all. So I think the flowchart is a necessary thing, not that it's complete, but I think, as a way to just get people quickly introduced to the sets of questions you should be asking yourself is good.
Yeah.
And I do think that kind of flippant thing at the end of the flowchart, which I found quite amusing, is it actually kind of more in the spirit of Wikipedia than being kind of dismissive.
It's not the best of Wikipedia, though.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, if you read our policy pages, they do inject a bit of humor and weirdness into it, and I think that last one basically says, well, it's out of your hands now. There's nothing for you to do except just complain about it or find some form to get a sympathetic ear.
What really
like set up a trolling site and build up a community and.
No, I didn't say that. It said you have no more recourse by policy. Find some other sympathetic ear. That's what I read in that.
It should say, if at this point you haven't succeeded, you should hire Pete or Bill.
There you go. That's what we should. No, I'm just kidding.
But honestly, like I mean, I'm happy when I have a client that comes to me that learned. I'm happiest when they come to me when they looked at Wikipedia. They tried to they tried to do something lightly, and they had the presence of mind and notice that they were in over their head, and then they call me before they get in big trouble. And I think telling a generic person follow this chart and then call someone if you get to the end of it, and you're like, honestly, like a lot of those clients, I would just say, I can't help you. You're like,
You're hopeless.
It's going to be too expensive for you, or it's going to be too frustrating for me, and it's just not worth it. If you've already kind of dug yourself in.
I have told my own college. I've walked up to my into our PR office and went, no, you can't do that. Because I saw an account editing, which it has the same format as our email addresses here. And I just sent an email off to that person and said, with an email that I was actually a freshman, went something to the effect of, I don't think you're doing what you think you're doing. Let me help you not cause a firestorm after my school caused a firestorm earlier that year on ANI for a editing exercise gone wrong. So I have some sympathy for anybody who's coming in new who thinks that this is simple and then finds out that they're in over their head.
Oh, absolutely.
I think before we end today, though, we should go through the top 25 of the week because it's an interesting list of articles.
Yeah, I thought it was actually quite interesting to see those things. So tell us what was the number one, which is a little bit depressing, actually.
Number one is Slender Man, which was a creepypasta that made its way around the internet and then spawned a series of YouTube videos. And after that, a woman allegedly stabbed a classmate 19 times due to...
Two girls stabbed their classmate, yeah.
Due to the influence of this meme, I guess.
And I'm a complete square. I'd never heard of Slender Man before, so maybe I'm just completely out of it. So
I'm with you.
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
we're
the fuddy duddies of the call, apparently.
Tom, have you heard of Slender Man, Tom?
Yes, I've read the creepypasta. I got halfway through the YouTube series, but it was obviously faked.
Okay. Oh, is it like a Blair Witch Project for the next generation?
Kind of.
Okay.
There's a mythos behind it. I don't know. It's weird, is the best way to describe it.
Tom, wasn't there some odd Wikia connection to this, too? That the main place where Slender Man was being discussed or developed was on a Wikia?
That would make sense, because there is no one place where Slender Man stuff comes from. There was a creepypasta that might have been posted on, like, 4chan or Reddit or somewhere like that. Then from there, it took on a life of its own.
Right.
It's something awful.
Something awful, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Well, the rest of them kind of make sense. All very news.
The next one's the...
Go ahead.
I mean, the World Cup makes sense. Game of Thrones makes sense. The Normandy landings make sense. The Fault in Our Stars comes in at 8 as a longtime John Green fan and a reader of all of his books. I don't know. Everything seems pretty standard. What do you guys think?
I mean, on a political point, Bo Bergdahl, the Army, was he the Army? U.S. soldier turned deserter, turned captive, turned, returnee, turned political lightning rod. He's in number 6, and that's not terribly surprising to me. I'm actually surprised that Normandy landings are had at Bo Bergdahl, just because Bo Bergdahl's name's been all over the news, all over Daily Show. And Normandy landings, I realize it's the anniversary, but I feel like it wasn't as it wasn't new news, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Normandy is international, though. So
sure.
I just noticed
people around the world were looking at Normandy. Go ahead, Pete. Must be our microphones.
Yeah, sorry. I was just noticing that the pilot of Lost is what is it, number 21. I'm just trying to read this through as I'm speaking, actually. But I was wondering if that suddenly launched on Netflix or something like that.
I don't know. That's interesting.
21.
Because that's a pretty old show at this point.
Yeah.
Oh, it was a topic.
It became a topic of a Reddit thread.
There we go.
I think it is now all on Netflix, though.
Yeah, but I'll bet it's the Reddit connection, though. I missed that last sentence there.
I think it's interesting that
I'm
Amazon got
surprised
to
that
number
a Song
11
of Fire
based on its.
Ice.
Oh, we got that delay. Yeah, Song of Ice and Fire is down at number 25.
Yeah.
Because he just announced last week that he might go to 8 books with it, which really should have surprised nobody. He'll go to like 9 books at least.
Yeah, and then list of Bollywood films always in the top 25 for some reason. That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Edge of Tomorrow, Orange is the New Black season premiered this last week.
Mm-hmm.
Tiananmen
Yes,
Square protest
I've been told 50 times that I need to watch it.
First season's very good. I do mean to watch the second one.
And then Alice on the Brady Bunch, the actress who played her, number 12.
She was great.
Yeah.
Watched way too much Brady Bunch as a preteen.
And then X-Men, interestingly.
Yeah, X-Men, the whole series. Yeah. I guess people are catching up on their X-Men storylines.
I like how for number 18 is Facebook, which, the only note is a perennially popular article. And a couple of weeks ago, I was putting together a presentation, like a slide deck about, interesting things about Wikipedia. And, I went looking for, like, what is the number one, most popular article on Wikipedia? And it really depends on how you ask the question. And so, Facebook and YouTube are two that keep coming up over and over again. I'm sure this is because people are trying to get to Facebook and YouTube, because those are the number 2 and 3 most visited pages on the internet. That it may be only at 18 right here, but because it's here every week, it floats to the top 5 over the course of a year.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Slender Man probably will, I'm going to assume, fall from the. I'm surprised at number 1. That it probably won't last long.
Well, the World Cup just started today, so that's going to rocket to the top for the next month, basically.
Totally. Game of Thrones is about done with its run. It has one more episode to go this season, so it'll drop at least for a bit.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing how many Game of Thrones topics are up here. So
yeah, more than others.
Yeah. Well, just a list of Game of Thrones episodes is number 7, which is just a listing of them, which is amazing to me. So.
We were trying to get to episodes to watch them.
Right. Catching up.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So thanks so much, guys. This has been really, really helpful to get a discussion of these things. And Pete, thanks for chiming in at last moment, a moment's notice on this thing. And we may or may not next week try to get some of the PR folks who are part of this agreement on an episode. So we'll just let you know and see if you can join us for that.
Okay. Sounds good.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, folks, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, and see you next time.
Oh,
Wikipedia Weekly.
One question: will this be archived, like on YouTube? Will it be on archive.org or Commons? How are you doing with that?
Immediately go to YouTube within like the next 30 minutes, and I will download a version of it and then cut it together, usually without any real editing, and just put a bumper on each end and put it onto archive.org as MP3.
Outstanding.
Great.
Oh, just the audio.
Just the audio, right? But the video is on YouTube.
Cool.
All right.
All right.
I'm going to stop the broadcast.